The crisis that changed everything. December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. Just before 8 o'clock on that Sunday morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed out of the sky over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. For the next 110 minutes, chaos reigned. Bombs tore through Battleship Row. Torpedoes ripped open the hulls of the Pacific Fleet. Fuel tanks exploded in towering columns of flame. When the smoke finally cleared, 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Over 350 aircraft were obliterated. Nearly 3,500 Americans were dead or wounded. But as devastating as the destruction was at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese made a critical mistake. They targeted the ships, not the infrastructure. The shipyard facilities at Pearl Harbor? Mostly intact. The massive fuel reserves that kept the Pacific Fleet running? Almost completely untouched. And perhaps most importantly, not a single American aircraft carrier was in port that day. Those 3 factors would give America a fighting chance to strike back. But there was one problem the Japanese attack revealed. A problem that nobody had fully anticipated. A problem that would become a crisis in the months ahead. The United States Navy didn't have enough people. Picture this. Before Pearl Harbor, recruiting for the Navy had been struggling. In November 1941, just 1 month before the attack, the Navy managed to recruit only 7,257 new sailors. That was far below what was needed, and officials were getting worried. The nation was divided about whether to get involved in another European war. Young men weren't exactly lining up to volunteer. Back in May 1941, President Roosevelt had declared a limited national emergency. He called for increasing the Navy's total personnel from 125,000 to 145,000 by the end of the year. Even that modest goal seemed hard to reach. Then Pearl Harbor changed everything overnight. Within 10 days of the attack, 42,000 recruits joined the Navy. Officials called it a recruiting bonanza. In January 1942 alone, nearly 60,000 more signed up. By June, the groundswell had reached almost 200,000 recruits in a single month. Young men across America were flooding into recruiting stations. They were desperate to fight back against the nation that had attacked their homeland. The patriotic fervor was unlike anything the country had seen before. But here's the thing. Even with all those volunteers pouring in, it still wasn't enough. Not even close. The Navy's projected growth before the war had been to reach 480,000 personnel by 1946. That seemed ambitious at the time. But by the end of 1945, the Navy would actually need to reach nearly 3.4 million officers and enlisted sailors. Think about that for a moment. The scale of what was coming was almost unimaginable. America would have to build over 1,200 combatant ships to fight this war. Every single one of those ships needed trained crews. And those crews couldn't just be bodies in uniforms. The modern Navy of 1942 was a technical marvel. It required radio operators, codebreakers, navigators, mechanics, medical personnel, parachute riggers, aviation specialists, instructors, lawyers, administrators, and hundreds of other skilled positions. So here was the question facing the Navy in early 1942. If every able-bodied man was going to be needed at sea, fighting the Japanese in the Pacific and the Germans in the Atlantic, who was going to run all the operations back on shore? Who was going to manage the 900 coastal stations across America? Who was going to train new recruits, maintain communication networks, break enemy codes, repair aircraft, manage medical facilities, process paperwork, and keep the entire massive shore establishment functioning? The answer was obvious to some people: women. But that answer was absolutely unacceptable to most of the Navy and to much of Congress. Here's what you need to understand about the cultural context. The United States Navy in 1942 was one of the most traditional, male-dominated institutions in America. The very idea of women serving in the Navy was seen as radical, even dangerous. Sure, women had served in limited roles during World War I as yeomen, designated with an F, doing clerical work. But that was supposed to be a temporary wartime aberration. The Navy had made sure those women were all discharged immediately after the war ended. The prevailing attitude was clear. Women belonged at home, not in uniform. Naval officers argued that ships at sea were no place for women. They claimed that having women in the service would destroy morale. They worried about discipline problems. They insisted that women simply didn't have the physical or mental capacity to handle military duties. And most fundamentally, they believed that allowing women into the Navy would undermine the masculine warrior culture that made the service effective. Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz, who was then heading the Navy's Bureau of Personnel before being promoted to Pacific Fleet Commander after Pearl Harbor, had testified to Congress that the Navy wanted to maintain its volunteer force. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had told President Roosevelt that maintaining morale depended on the fact that the Navy was entirely voluntary. No man was ordered to fly or serve on ships against his will. If the Navy was reluctant to even use draftees, how could they possibly accept women? But there were people fighting for change. A small group of determined women and their allies in government had been working behind the scenes for months. Even before Pearl Harbor, they'd been working to create a path for women to serve. One of the most important was Congresswoman Edith Nourse Rogers, who had introduced legislation to create the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Her efforts helped pave the way for similar legislation in other services. Dr. Margaret Chung, a pioneering Chinese-American physician and Navy advocate, had been pushing for a women's naval service since the late 1930s. And then there was Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, who would prove to be absolutely crucial. As Congress began debating whether to allow women in the Navy in the spring of 1942, the Navy brass were dragging their feet. They'd formed something called the Women's Advisory Council, made up of female college administrators, to study the issue. But many suspected this was just a delaying tactic, a way to look like they were considering it while actually hoping the whole idea would go away. The Advisory Council included Virginia Gildersleeve, Dean of Barnard College, and several other prominent educators. They brought in Elizabeth Reynard, a professor at Barnard, as a special assistant to Rear Admiral Randall Jacobs, who had taken over the Bureau of Naval Personnel after Nimitz was promoted. Reynard had a crucial task. If Congress actually approved a women's branch of the Navy, what would it be called? She came up with something brilliant. WAVES. Women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Notice the words carefully. Volunteer. Emergency. Service. Every word was chosen to reassure the skeptics. This was temporary, voluntary, and not a permanent change to the Navy's traditions. It was genius marketing for a revolutionary idea. But even with a catchy acronym, the legislation was stalling. In late May 1942, President Roosevelt initially approved a proposal that would make the women's branch auxiliary to the Navy, not actually part of it. That was a problem. Auxiliary status meant second-class treatment. It meant women wouldn't have the same military status, benefits, or authority as men. Several educators immediately pushed back. Dean Harriet Elliott of the University of North Carolina and Dean Gildersleeve wrote directly to Eleanor Roosevelt. They urged that women should be integrated into the Navy, not auxiliary to it. Dean C. Mildred Thompson of Vassar College and President Herman Davis of Smith College sent similar letters directly to President Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt took action. She forwarded the letters to the president and to Navy officials. And something shifted. On June 24th, the Senate Naval Affairs Committee reported favorably on a revised bill. This bill would make women full members of the Naval Reserve. By July 21st, the bill had passed both houses of Congress and been sent to President Roosevelt's desk. And there it sat. Days passed. Nobody knew if the president would actually sign it. Behind the scenes, Navy officials were likely hoping he wouldn't. The legislation represented a fundamental challenge to everything the Navy had been for its entire history. Finally, Eleanor Roosevelt made contact with her husband. Within a short time after that conversation, the decision was made. On July 30th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Public Law 689 into law. With the stroke of a pen, women were officially authorized to join the United States Naval Reserve as commissioned officers and enlisted sailors. The law stated that the purpose was clear: to release officers and men for sea duty and replace them with women in shore establishments. Women could serve for the duration of the war plus 6 months. They would hold ranks and rates consistent with the regular Navy. They could serve anywhere in the continental United States. But there were restrictions. No women on naval vessels. No women on combat aircraft. No women with command authority over men, except within the women's branch itself. Still, despite all those limitations, it was revolutionary. The waves were born. Now the Navy had to actually figure out how to make this work. And they needed a leader, someone with impeccable credentials, someone who commanded respect, someone who could convince both the skeptics in the Navy and the women of America that this wasn't just some publicity stunt. The Women's Advisory Council knew exactly who they wanted. Her name was Mildred H. McAfee, and she was about to become the first woman commissioned as an officer in United States Navy history. Creating a revolution, July 30th, 1942. Mildred Helen McAfee was 42 years old in the summer of 1942. She had been president of Wellesley College in Massachusetts since 1936. That made her one of the youngest college presidents in America when she was appointed at just 35 years old. Before that, she'd spent only 8 years total in academia. Yet, she'd risen to the top of one of the nation's most prestigious women's colleges. By all accounts, she was brilliant, efficient, good-humored, and completely unpretentious. She was exactly the kind of person who could command respect in a room full of skeptical male naval officers. And she was about to need every bit of that skill. On August 3rd, 1942, just 4 days after President Roosevelt signed Public Law 689 into law, Mildred McAfee was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the United States Naval Reserve. With that commission, she became the first woman in American history to hold the rank of officer in the United States Navy. Not an auxiliary officer, not a contractor, an actual commissioned line officer with the authority and responsibility that came with that rank. Think about what that meant. For 167 years, since the Navy's founding in 1775, no woman had ever worn a Navy officer's uniform. Now, suddenly, a college president who'd never served a day in the military was being handed the responsibility of building an entirely new branch of the service from scratch. She had to create training programs, establish standards, design uniforms, write regulations, recruit thousands of women. And she had to do all of this while navigating a bureaucracy that was deeply suspicious of the entire enterprise. McAfee later admitted in her oral history that the Navy had resisted the whole idea of having women in the service. But the manpower shortage was simply too severe to ignore. The nation was at war. Men were being drafted and sent overseas at an unprecedented rate. The Navy needed bodies to fill critical shore positions, and women were the only answer. Still, there was enormous cultural resistance to overcome. The Navy wanted to maintain its volunteer tradition. Naval officials worried that forcing change too quickly would destroy morale. So McAfee had to be strategic. She had to prove that women could serve with distinction. At the same time, she had to reassure conservative parents, schools, churches, and the general public that the waves would maintain proper decorum and ladylike behavior. It was a delicate balancing act. Too aggressive, and she'd trigger a backlash. Too cautious, and the waves would be marginalized and ineffective. One of the first challenges was the name itself. McAfee later recalled that she'd been extremely high-minded about the whole thing initially. She thought women should just be known by their ranks, the same as men. No special designation necessary. But then she saw a newspaper headline in Washington that summer that changed her mind. The headline read, "Goblettes has come to town." It was a play on the slang term, gobs, which was what Navy men were sometimes called. Imagine how that must have felt. The thought of female sailors being called Goblettes was absolutely horrifying to McAfee. It was demeaning and ridiculous. That's when she realized that Elizabeth Reynard's acronym, WAVES, was actually brilliant. It was dignified. It evoked the Navy's connection to the sea, and it gave the women's branch an identity that commanded respect. The full name, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, was carefully constructed to emphasize key points. Volunteer signaled that this wasn't conscription. Emergency reassured skeptics that it was temporary. Service highlighted patriotic duty. Every word mattered. With the name settled and McAfee officially in command, the next step was figuring out how to actually train these women. The Navy needed two separate training pipelines, one for officers and one for enlisted personnel. The officer candidates would need to be college-educated women who could step into leadership and administrative roles immediately. The enlisted recruits would need to be high school graduates who could be trained in specific technical specialties. For the officer training school, the Navy needed a location that could accommodate hundreds of women. It needed to provide dormitory space, classrooms, and a professional academic environment. The Women's Advisory Council proposed Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was perfect. Smith had the facilities. The location was accessible, and a college setting would reinforce the professional, educated image that McAfee wanted for the waves. The Navy agreed. Smith College was designated as the United States Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School. Everyone affectionately called it USS Northampton. To command the school, the Navy recalled Captain Herbert W. Underwood to active duty on August 13, 1942. Underwood was a World War I veteran who'd received the Navy Cross for his service. He was intelligent, enthusiastic, good-humored, and serious about his mission. More importantly, he believed in what the waves were trying to accomplish. Underwood and his staff had an enormous challenge ahead of them. They had to develop an entirely new curriculum from scratch that would transform civilian women into naval officers in just 2 months. 2 months. That's barely enough time to teach someone basic naval terminology, let alone prepare them to run shore operations. But that was all the time they had. The Navy needed these women in position immediately. The curriculum they designed covered everything: organization, personnel, naval history and law, ships and aircraft, naval communications, and correspondence. Lieutenant Commander Mary Virginia Harris wrote a manual specifically for waves and their Coast Guard counterparts. That manual detailed all the military etiquette and naval knowledge the recruits needed to know. The training was intensive. The objective wasn't to produce fully trained naval officers in 2 months. That was impossible. Instead, the goal was to give the candidates a basic understanding of the naval environment while stressing administrative policy, because that's what most of them would be doing. The first class began training in August 1942. It was a fast-track class designed to get the initial group of officers commissioned as quickly as possible. Regular officer training began in October. The requirements to get in were strict. Women had to be between 20 and 49 years old. They needed a college degree or at least 2 years of college plus 2 years of equivalent professional or business experience. United States citizenship was required. And perhaps most tellingly, the women who came were primarily white and middle class. The Navy wasn't ready to integrate yet. That battle would come later. By the end of 1942, 770 women had been commissioned as WWII officers. That might not sound like a lot, but consider what it represented. 770 women who, just months earlier, had been civilians. They were now naval officers with the authority to give orders, manage personnel, and run critical operations. It was unprecedented. Meanwhile, enlisted training was happening in parallel, though it took longer to get organized. The Navy initially selected 3 locations for enlisted recruit training: Oklahoma A&M College, Indiana University, and the University of Wisconsin. Training began on October 9, 1942. But the Navy quickly realized these arrangements weren't working. The facilities were too dispersed. The instructors were inexperienced. And critically, there was no sense of esprit de corps. The women didn't feel like they were part of something unified. They felt scattered. So the Navy made a change. They decided to establish one centralized recruit training center at Iowa State Teachers College. Captain Randall Davis was named commanding officer and arrived on December 1, 1942. 2 weeks later, the first class of 1,050 enlisted recruits began their 5 weeks of basic training. The routine was grueling. Weekday mornings started with classes and drill, repeated in the afternoon. Free time in the evening, followed by study or instruction until taps. Saturday morning was the captain's inspection, with the rest of the day free. Sundays included church services and more free time, followed by study hours until taps. But even this arrangement didn't last long. On December 30th, 1942, the Navy announced that all future recruits would be trained at Hunter College in the Bronx, New York City. Hunter College was chosen because of its space, location, ease of transportation, and the college's willingness to make its facilities available. Captain William F. Amston, another World War I Navy Cross recipient, was named commanding officer. On February 8, 1943, Hunter College was officially commissioned as the U.S. Naval Training Center, the Bronx. It became known as USS Hunter. 9 days later, approximately 2,000 recruits began their 6 weeks of training. The objective was to make the boot camp experience for women similar to what the men experienced. The curriculum included Navy ranks and rates, ships and aircraft of the fleet, naval traditions and customs, naval history, and heavy emphasis on physical fitness. USS Hunter would become the training ground for the vast majority of WWIIs throughout the war. Between February 17, 1943 and October 10, 1945, some 80,936 WWIIs completed training there. That's not counting the 1,844 spars, Coast Guard Women's Reserve members, and 3,190 women Marines who also trained at Hunter until they established their own training centers in the summer of 1943. Here's what those numbers actually mean. By the end of 1942, there were 770 WWII officers and 3,109 enlisted women in the service. It was a modest beginning, but it was a beginning. The recruitment campaign was just getting started. The Navy used every tool available: radio, newspapers, posters, brochures, and personal contacts. The message was simple and powerful: patriotism, the need for women to free up men for overseas duty. a chance to serve your country in its darkest hour. And McAfee was adamant about one thing: good taste in all advertising. She was determined to cast the waves in a ladylike fashion. Her reasoning was strategic. Advertising must appeal to conservative parents, schools, and churches as well as to the young women themselves, she said. She understood that if the waves were going to succeed, they needed to win over not just potential recruits, but also the gatekeepers who could encourage or discourage young women from serving. Parents needed to believe their daughters would be safe and treated with respect. Churches needed to see the service as morally appropriate. Schools needed to view it as a respectable career path, even if temporary. And it worked. By July 3rd, 1945, the Waves had grown to 86,291 members. That included 8,475 officers, 73,816 enlisted, and about 4,000 in training. In less than 3 years, the Waves had gone from zero to one of the largest organizations of professional women in American history. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. What mattered was what these women actually did once they completed their training. And that's where the Real Revolution happened. Because the Waves didn't just fill clerical positions, although they did that too. They took over entire operational systems that were critical to winning the war. They became the backbone of the Navy's shore establishment. And they did it so well that by the end of the war, Navy leadership couldn't imagine operating without them. The question was no longer whether women could serve in the Navy. The question was how the Navy had ever functioned without them. Taking over naval operations, the clerical revolution, here's something most people don't understand about World War II. The war wasn't just won on battlefields and beaches. It was won in offices, communication centers, and administrative buildings scattered across 900 shore stations throughout the United States. And by 1943, women were running those operations. The Navy's shore establishment was massive. It included everything from major naval bases to small recruiting offices, from communication hubs to supply depots, from training facilities to research laboratories. Every single one of these locations required constant coordination, communication, and documentation. Orders had to be written, transmitted, received, and filed. Personnel records had to be maintained. Supply requisitions had to be processed. Reports had to be compiled and sent up the chain of command. Fleet post offices had to sort and distribute mail to sailors deployed across the entire globe. Before the Waves, all of this work was done by men who could have been serving at sea. The Navy's leadership called them desk sailors, and there was always tension about whether keeping men in administrative roles was the best use of manpower. After Pearl Harbor, that tension became a crisis. The Navy needed every trained man who could physically serve at sea to actually be at sea. The shore establishment had to be staffed by someone else. Enter the Waves yeomen. During World War II, approximately 14,000 women served as yeomen in the Waves. These weren't secretaries or clerks in the civilian sense, although that's how many people thought of them. Yeomen were the Navy's administrative specialists. They were responsible for preparing and routing correspondence, maintaining personnel records, managing classified documents, operating communication equipment, and basically keeping the entire bureaucratic machinery of the Navy functioning smoothly. And they were really good at it. Captain Underwood at Smith College had made sure that the Waves officer training included extensive instruction in naval correspondence, administrative procedures, and organizational structure. The enlisted training at USS Hunter emphasized the same skills. When these women graduated and arrived at their duty stations, they weren't learning on the job. They were already trained and ready to take over operations immediately. The impact was dramatic. At naval districts across the country, Waves yeomen stepped into positions that had been held by male sailors. They performed the work with such efficiency that commanding officers were amazed. Lieutenant Commander Mary Virginia Harris, who had written the training manual for Waves, later observed that the women brought a level of professionalism and attention to detail that exceeded what the Navy had experienced before. Part of that was education. Many Waves yeomen were college graduates or had significant business experience before enlisting. They understood complex systems. They could write clearly and organize information effectively. But it was more than just education. Here's what really drove them. These women had something to prove. They knew that skeptics were watching, waiting for them to fail. They knew that if they didn't perform at the highest level, it would be used as evidence that women didn't belong in the Navy. So they worked harder, stayed later, and demanded more of themselves than anyone else did. And slowly, station by station, the skeptics became believers. Fleet post offices provide a perfect example. Managing mail for the Navy during World War II was an incredibly complex operation. Think about the logistics for a moment. You had hundreds of thousands of sailors deployed on ships that were constantly moving. Addresses were changing. Men were being transferred. Ships were being damaged or sunk. And yet, somehow, letters from home had to find their way to the right person. The emotional importance of mail can't be overstated. For a sailor thousands of miles from home, living in constant danger, a letter from his wife or mother or girlfriend was everything. It was connection. It was hope. It was a reminder of what he was fighting for. Waves yeomen managed that system. They tracked ship movements. They updated address lists. They sorted thousands of pieces of mail every single day. They made sure that when a sailor's ship pulled into port, his letters were waiting for him. It was tedious work. It was unglamorous work. But it was absolutely essential to maintaining morale across the entire fleet. Communication centers were another critical area where Waves yeomen made an enormous difference. The Navy's communication network during World War II was one of the most sophisticated in the world. Messages had to be transmitted between shore stations, ships at sea, and naval commands around the globe. Much of this communication was classified. Some of it was top secret. The women who worked in these centers had to be trustworthy, detail-oriented, and absolutely precise. A single error in transmitting coordinates or orders could result in ships being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lives depended on accuracy. And again, Waves yeomen proved themselves more than capable. They operated teletype machines. They encrypted and decrypted messages. They maintained communication logs. And they ensured that information flowed smoothly through the system. Officers who had been skeptical about allowing women access to classified information quickly realized that these women were just as professional and security conscious as any man in the Navy. By 1944, Waves yeomen were considered indispensable. The Navy's Bureau of Personnel, which had initially resisted the entire idea of women in the service, was now requesting more Waves for administrative positions. Commanding officers who had grudgingly accepted their first Waves were writing letters praising their performance and asking for additional personnel. The transformation was complete. Women weren't just filling in temporarily. They were running naval operations, and they were doing it better than many people had thought possible. The medical corps breakthrough while Waves yeomen were revolutionizing administrative operations. Another group of women was making history in an entirely different field. The Navy's medical establishment, which had been exclusively male except for nurses, was about to experience its own transformation. 13,000 Waves served as hospital corpsmen during World War II. And for the first time in the Navy's history, the service commissioned female physicians. Let's start with the hospital corpsmen because their story is remarkable. In the Navy, hospital corpsmen were the medical technicians who provided direct patient care in hospitals, dispensaries, sick bays on ships, and even on battlefields. They weren't nurses. They weren't doctors. They were somewhere in between. They took vital signs, administered medications, assisted in surgeries, provided emergency first aid, maintained medical records, and essentially kept the Navy's entire medical system functioning. Before the war, all hospital corpsmen were men. The very idea of women in this role was controversial. Many in the Navy believed that medical care, particularly in military settings, was inherently masculine work. There were concerns about women seeing male patients in various states of undress. There were worries about whether women had the physical strength to lift patients or the emotional fortitude to handle traumatic injuries. And there was the broader cultural assumption that women belonged in nursing if they were going to work in medicine at all, not in technical medical support roles. But the manpower crisis didn't care about cultural assumptions. The Navy needed trained medical personnel, and it needed them desperately. As the war expanded, casualties mounted. The Fleet Marine Force was suffering horrendous losses in the Pacific Island campaigns. Hospital corpsmen were being killed alongside the Marines they served. At Iwo Jima, hospital corps casualties in the 4th Marine Division reached 38%. The Navy couldn't afford to exclude women from this critical field. So the decision was made. WWIIs would be trained as hospital corpsmen, and not just for basic duties. They would receive the same training as male hospital corpsmen and be qualified to work in the same capacities. The training pipeline was rigorous. WWII's hospital corpsmen attended the Navy's Hospital Corps School. There they learned anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, first aid, surgical assisting, and medical administration. They studied disease recognition and treatment. They practiced taking blood, giving injections, and dressing wounds. By the time they graduated, they were fully qualified medical technicians. And then they went to work. WWII's hospital corpsmen served in naval hospitals across the United States. They worked at major medical centers like Naval Hospital Jacksonville and at smaller dispensaries on bases throughout the country. They cared for wounded sailors and Marines who were evacuated from combat zones. They assisted in surgeries. They worked in pharmacy departments, compounding medications. They managed medical supply chains, ensuring that hospitals had the equipment and drugs they needed. Dorothy Helen Farmer was one such WWII. She served as a pharmacist's mate, the rating name for hospital corpsmen at the time. She worked in research and medical support. Her duties included everything from direct patient care to laboratory work to administrative support for Navy physicians. Like so many other WWIIs, she brought a level of professionalism and dedication that impressed everyone she worked with. The impact extended beyond just filling positions. WWII's hospital corpsmen changed the culture of Navy medicine. They brought different perspectives to patient care. Many had backgrounds in nursing, laboratory science, or other medical fields before joining the WWIIs. They introduced techniques and approaches that male hospital corpsmen hadn't considered. And critically, their presence in naval hospitals made male patients more comfortable in some situations, particularly when dealing with certain types of injuries or medical conditions. But perhaps the most revolutionary development was the commissioning of female physicians. For the first time in the Navy's 167-year history, women were not just nurses or medical technicians. They were doctors with full authority to diagnose, treat, and prescribe. This was an enormous breakthrough, not just for the WWIIs, but for women in medicine generally. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery had resisted this change even more than other bureaus had resisted the WWIIs in general. The medical establishment was deeply conservative and male-dominated. The idea of female physicians having authority over male patients was seen as completely inappropriate by many senior medical officers. What's more, Having authority over male hospital corpsmen seemed even worse to them. But again, necessity overruled prejudice. The Navy needed doctors. Medical schools were producing female physicians, and those women wanted to serve their country. There was no logical reason to exclude them except outdated cultural beliefs. So the barriers came down. The Navy commissioned its first female physicians as WWII officers. They went to work in naval hospitals alongside their male colleagues. Their presence was transformative. These women weren't just filling slots. They were proving that medical expertise had nothing to do with gender. They performed surgeries. They made diagnoses. They trained hospital corpsmen. They contributed to medical research. And slowly, the Navy's medical establishment realized what should have been obvious from the beginning: competence isn't gendered. By the end of the war, the Navy's medical system had been fundamentally changed. The hospital corps had expanded to 169,225 personnel. It achieved an unprecedented 98% recovery rate for combat casualties. WWII's hospital corpsmen were a critical part of that success. They had proven that women could serve in technical medical roles just as effectively as men. They had opened doors for future generations of women in Navy medicine, and they had saved countless lives in the process. The question was no longer whether women belonged in Navy medicine. The question was how the Navy had ever managed without them. The Technical Revolution Codebreakers and the Secret War. Some of the most important work done by WWIIs during World War II remained classified for decades after the war ended. These women couldn't talk about what they'd done. They couldn't tell their families. They couldn't share their experiences with historians. They took their secrets to the grave. Only in recent years have we begun to understand the full scope of their contribution to winning the war. They were codebreakers, and they helped change the course of history. Before the United States entered World War II, the Navy already knew it would need women for cryptanalysis work. In 1941, Rear Admiral Noyes approached several women's colleges and universities with a proposition. He wanted to establish secret encryption classes for select students. These women would learn the basics of cryptology and cryptanalysis. Then, after graduation, they would work for the Navy decoding access messages. It was an audacious plan. The Navy's codebreaking operation was one of its most closely guarded secrets. Letting women into that world represented a massive shift in thinking. But the Navy didn't have a choice. Breaking enemy codes required specific skills: mathematical ability, pattern recognition, attention to detail, linguistic capability, and most importantly, the ability to work for hours on mind-numbing tasks without making a single error. Many of the men who possessed those skills were being sent overseas to fight. The Navy needed replacements. And it turned out that highly educated women from elite colleges were perfect for the job. After Public Law 689 established the WWIIs in July 1942, many of these women who had been trained in encryption formally enlisted. They became part of the Navy's Communication Security Division. They worked at facilities in Washington, D.C., and at specialized centers around the country. Their work fell into several categories. Some manually decoded access messages, working through complex cipher systems by hand. Others built the machines that would automate the decryption process. And still others operated those machines around the clock, processing thousands of encrypted messages. The German military had a huge advantage early in the war: the Enigma machine. This was an encryption device that the Germans believed produced an unbreakable code. Here's how it worked. To decrypt an Enigma encrypted message, you needed both an Enigma machine and knowledge of all the correct settings for that particular day. The settings changed constantly, making the task of breaking the code extraordinarily difficult. Polish, British, and American cryptographers had been working on the problem for years. They developed machines called bombs that could break Enigma code, but it was a race against time. Each bomb needed to be programmed with specific information. And even then, it could take hours or days to decrypt a single message. The United States Navy decided to build as many bombs as possible and staff them with trained operators who could run them efficiently. The bombs were massive machines, 7 feet high, 2 feet wide, 10 feet long, and weighing 5,000 pounds each. When properly programmed, they could decipher Axis code in hours rather than weeks when done by hand. But they required constant attention and skilled operators who understood both the machines and the cryptographic principles behind them. The Navy sent approximately 600 newly inducted WWIIs, along with 200 men, to Dayton, Ohio, to help build and train on the cryptanalytic bombs. The women were given a critical task. Each bomb required 64 rotors to be wired to match the rotors actually used in the Germans' Enigma machines. WWIIs performed this work. Each woman was given a wiring diagram for one side of a 2-sided rotor. She spent her 8-hour shift soldering wires to rotors, working with absolute precision. A single error in the wiring could make an entire bomb useless. The work was tedious, eye-straining, and incredibly important. But here's what made this work even more remarkable. The Navy told these women almost nothing about what they were actually doing. The women knew they were building something for the Navy. They knew it was classified, but they had no idea how their work fit into the broader war effort. WWII Georgia Luddington later explained, "We weren't supposed to know anything. We just did something and it didn't all fit in. We didn't know the big picture. This was intentional." The Navy maintained strict compartmentalization to protect the secrecy of the operation. Even within the codebreaking facilities, different groups of people knew different pieces of information. But nobody except the highest-ranking officers understood the entire system. One WWII recalled that she was allowed to access most areas of the building where she worked, except the actual codebreaking room. Only 4 or 5 high-ranking officers were allowed to enter that space. Once the bombs were built and tested, WWIIs became the primary operators. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, running the machines that decrypted German naval communications. The work required intense concentration. The operators had to understand the machine settings, monitor the output, recognize when the machine had found a potential solution, and then verify that solution using additional cryptanalytic techniques. It was highly technical work that required both intelligence and discipline. The results were extraordinary. The Navy's decryption work helped plan D-Day. It helped destroy U-boats in the Atlantic. It helped track German naval movements throughout the war. Estimates claim that Allied codebreakers shortened the war by as much as 2 years and saved countless lives. WWIIs were an essential part of that success. Yet for decades after the war, they couldn't talk about it. The work remained classified until the 1990s. But cryptanalysis wasn't the only secret work WWIIs performed. Some were involved in protecting information related to the Manhattan Project, the ultra-secret program to develop the atomic bomb. Rosemary Fagot's story illustrates just how trusted these women were with the nation's most sensitive secrets. Fagot was born in Nicaragua, but was registered as an American citizen because her father was from New Orleans. She had limited formal education and was working at a gold mine with her father when she saw an article about the Navy WWIIs in Life magazine. She was 17 years old when she applied. After a naval member interviewed her parents in Nicaragua, she was accepted. She saved money by teaching nursery school to pay for her trip to New Orleans, where an uncle took her to the Navy office to be sworn in. Despite her heavy accent and language barrier, Fagot received excellent marks on her aptitude tests. She was sent to Iowa State Teachers College for naval intelligence training, where she learned shorthand and typing for nearly 5 months. Then she was transferred to Miami, Florida, where she worked at the DuPont building as a personal yeoman to Captain WWII. Miami was the center for international liaisons. Faget handled greeting international officials, translating during meetings, and recording important information. But the most remarkable part of her service came later. Faget recalled being required to carry a gun and learn how to shoot it. Why? Because she was sometimes carrying documents related to the atomic bomb project. In her own words, because it was when the A-bomb came out, and we had some papers and things, and we were aware that this was happening, we had to be very cautious and not read any more than we had to. We knew that there was something going on, and we knew that it was something serious. They were afraid that we might be caught to get something out of us, so we had to be cautious at that time, during that period, until the bomb gave way, and then we knew what it was all about. Think about what that represents. A 17-year-old immigrant woman with limited formal education was trusted by the United States Navy to carry documents related to the most important secret weapon in human history. She was trained to defend those documents with her life, and she did her job without ever betraying that trust. The Navy's confidence in waves like Rosemary Faget speaks volumes about the professionalism and dedication these women demonstrated. The cryptographic work performed by waves represents one of the war's most important untold stories. These women operated in complete secrecy. They saved lives. They shortened the war. And they proved that technical, classified work that required the highest levels of trust and expertise could be performed by women just as effectively as by men. Grace Hopper and the Mark I computer. While some waves were breaking enemy codes, others were building the future. And no wave better represents that achievement than Lieutenant Grace Murray Hopper. She became one of the first computer programmers in history and laid the foundation for the entire modern computing industry. Grace Hopper was born in 1906 in New York City. She earned a PhD in mathematics from Yale University in 1934, one of the first women to do so. She became a professor at Vassar College. When the waves were established in 1942, Hopper wanted to serve. She was 36 years old, technically over the age limit. And weighing just 105 pounds, she was considered too light for military service. But she was persistent. She received a waiver and was commissioned as a lieutenant, junior grade, in the United States Naval Reserve in December 1943. The Navy, recognizing her exceptional mathematical abilities, assigned her to the Bureau of Ordnance Computation Project at Harvard University. She arrived in July 1944 and was introduced to Professor Howard Aiken, who was running a top-secret project for the Navy. Aiken showed her a machine and gave her a week to learn how to program it. The machine was called the Harvard Mark I, also known as the IBM Automatic Sequence Controlled Calculator. It was one of the earliest general-purpose electromechanical computers used in the war effort. And it was absolutely massive. 51 feet long, 8 feet high, and 5 feet deep. The Mark I weighed 5 tons and contained almost 760,000 separate pieces. It used 3,000 storage wheels, 1,400 rotary dial switches, and 500 miles of wire. Hopper later recalled her first impression. That was an impressive beast. Imagine standing in front of that machine for the first time. The Mark I was programmed using pre-punched paper tape. It could perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and reference to previous results. It had special subroutines for logarithms and trigonometry and used 23 decimal place numbers. The machine could do 3 additions or subtractions in a second. A multiplication took 6 seconds. A division took 15.3 seconds. And a logarithm or trigonometric function took over 1 minute. By modern standards, that's incredibly slow. But in 1944, it was revolutionary. Hopper became the third person to program the Mark I. She quickly became one of the machine's primary operators. The Navy was using the Mark I to compute firing tables for naval artillery. These calculations were extremely complex. They required trigonometric functions, logarithms, and multiple iterations to account for variables like wind, temperature, humidity, the rotation of the Earth, and the trajectory of the shell. Doing these calculations by hand would take weeks or months. The Mark I could do them in hours. But the Mark I wasn't just used for firing tables. It was also used for a wide range of other military calculations during the war. Some of those calculations related to the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb program. Hopper and her team performed computations that contributed to the development of the weapon that would eventually end the war. Hopper's contribution extended far beyond just operating the machine. She wrote the first computer manual, a manual of operation for the automatic sequence controlled calculator. This 3-volume work explained how to program and operate the Mark I. It became the foundational text for a generation of early computer programmers. In many ways, Hopper invented the concept of computer documentation. She also developed new programming techniques. Early programming was extremely difficult because the machine only understood numerical machine code. Programmers had to translate every instruction into numbers. Hopper began developing methods to make programming easier and more intuitive. This work would eventually lead to her creation of the first compiler in the 1950s. A compiler is a system that allowed programmers to write code in plain English rather than numerical machine code. She also co-developed COBOL, one of the first high-level commercial computer programming languages. But during the war, she was focused on making the Mark I work for the Navy. She and her small team, which included Ensign Richard Block and Ensign Robert Campbell, worked long hours writing programs, debugging code, and running calculations. There was also a technical team of enlisted men who actually operated the machine, though they weren't informed of the overall purpose of their work while at Harvard. This was another example of the Navy's compartmentalization policy. The operators didn't need to know what the calculations were for, only how to run the machine properly. Hopper received the Naval Ordnance Development Award for her pioneering applications programming success on the Mark I, Mark II, and Mark III computers. When the war ended, she left active duty but remained in the Naval Reserve. She continued working on computer development at Harvard and later in private industry. But she never really left the Navy. She continued her military career for decades, eventually retiring in 1986 as a Rear Admiral. The Mark I remained in service for the Navy until 1959. It computed everything from rocket trajectories to nuclear physics calculations. But its real legacy was what it represented, the birth of the computer age. And Grace Hopper, a WWII who joined the Navy to serve her country in wartime, became one of the founding figures of the computer revolution. The Bureau of Ordnance's decision to assign a highly qualified female mathematician to the Mark I project wasn't unique. Throughout the war, the Bureau actively sought WWIIs with technical backgrounds in mathematics, physics, and engineering. These women worked on advanced projects that required the highest levels of technical expertise. They performed calculations for weapons development. They analyzed ballistics data. They contributed to research projects that would shape the post-war world. What does all this tell us? The technical revolution brought about by WWIIs wasn't limited to computers and codebreaking. It extended to virtually every area of naval operations that required specialized knowledge. And it proved, beyond any doubt, that women could contribute to the most advanced technical and scientific work the military performed. The stereotype of women as only capable of clerical or nursing work was shattered completely. WWIIs were running some of the most sophisticated operations the Navy had ever undertaken. And they were just getting started. commanding the sky's 23,000 waves in naval aviation. If you wanted to find the place where waves made their most visible and dramatic impact during World War II, you wouldn't look in the code-breaking facilities or computer labs. You'd look up, because more than 23,000 waves served in naval aviation during the war. That made the Bureau of Aeronautics the single largest employer of women in the entire Navy. And these women weren't just doing paperwork. They were maintaining aircraft, rigging parachutes, operating control towers, teaching gunnery, training pilots in flight simulators, forecasting weather, and basically running the entire shore-based aviation establishment that kept American naval air power in the sky. The Bureau of Aeronautics was unique among Navy bureaus in how receptive it was to the waves from the very beginning. Part of that was due to the influence of Lieutenant Joy Bright Hancock. She had served as a yeoman, designated with an F, during World War I. She then worked as a civilian at the Bureau of Aeronautics before World War II. When the waves were established, Hancock became the women's reserve representative for the Bureau. She understood aviation. She understood the Navy. And she understood that women could perform the technical work required in naval aviation if given proper training and opportunities. Under Hancock's influence, the Bureau of Aeronautics opened positions for waves in fields that other bureaus considered too technical or too masculine for women: engineering, gunnery, radio and radar, aircraft navigation, and air traffic control. The Bureau needed skilled personnel desperately, and it was willing to look past gender if it meant getting qualified people into critical positions. Aviation machinist mates were one of the largest groups. These women worked on naval air stations across the country, maintaining the thousands of aircraft that the Navy operated during the war. They performed engine maintenance, replaced parts, diagnosed mechanical problems, and ensured that every plane was airworthy before it took off. The work required both physical strength and technical knowledge. You had to understand how aircraft engines worked. You had to be able to read technical manuals and follow precise procedures. And you had to work quickly, because aircraft needed to be ready when pilots needed to fly. Then there were the aviation metalsmiths. These were women who worked with sheet metal to repair aircraft fuselages and wings. When a plane was damaged, either in training or in combat after it returned to the United States, these women fabricated replacement parts, welded metal, and restored the aircraft to flying condition. It was skilled metalworking that required precision and attention to detail. A poorly repaired aircraft could fail in flight, killing the crew. The responsibility was enormous. Parachute riggers performed one of the most critical safety roles in all of naval aviation. These waves were responsible for packing, inspecting, and maintaining parachutes. Every single parachute that a naval aviator wore had been packed by someone, often a wave. And that person's work was the difference between life and death if something went wrong. Think about the pressure of that job. A pilot jumps from a damaged aircraft at 10,000 feet. He pulls the ripcord, and his survival depends entirely on whether the parachute rigger did her job correctly. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and a man dies. Wave's parachute riggers understood that responsibility. They inspected every inch of silk. They followed precise folding procedures. They tested the mechanisms. And they signed their name to every parachute they packed, taking personal responsibility for that pilot's life. The level of trust placed in these women was extraordinary, and they earned that trust through flawless performance. Control tower operators were another critical role that waves filled. At busy naval air stations where dozens or even hundreds of flights took off and landed every day, the control tower was the nerve center that kept everything organized and safe. Waves in the tower communicated with pilots. They provided clearances for takeoff and landing. They monitored weather conditions. They coordinated flight patterns. and they made split-second decisions that prevented mid-air collisions or runway accidents. It required calm under pressure, clear communication, and absolute attention to detail. Lives depended on every word spoken over the radio. Radio operators managed the communication networks that connected naval air stations to aircraft in flight and to each other. They transmitted orders, received status reports, relayed weather information, and maintained constant communication with pilots during training missions and operational flights. Like the yeomen working in communication centers, these women handled classified information and operated sophisticated radio equipment. Many had received specialized training in radio technology and communication protocols. But perhaps the most prestigious and technically demanding roles in naval aviation were the positions that required advanced education and specialized knowledge: gunnery instructors, link trainer instructors, and aerographers. Gunnery instructors were waves who taught male sailors how to operate aircraft-mounted weapon systems. Imagine that for a moment. This was considered radical at the time. The idea of women teaching men how to shoot was contrary to every cultural assumption about gender roles. But the Navy needed instructors, and many waves had the intelligence and teaching ability to do the job effectively. They learned how the weapon systems worked, how to aim at moving targets, how to lead a target based on speed and distance, and how to troubleshoot mechanical problems. Josette Dermody Wingo, who served as a gunner's mate in San Francisco, later wrote a book titled "Mother Was a Gunner's Mate" about her experiences. Pat Connolly served as a gunnery instructor in Pensacola, Florida, teaching men the technical skills they needed to survive in combat. These women brought a level of professionalism and attention to detail that made them excellent instructors. Many had been teachers in civilian life and understood how to break down complex tasks into learnable steps. The students, initially skeptical about being taught by women, quickly realized that these instructors knew their subject matter thoroughly and demanded high standards. The Waves gunnery instructors weren't trying to be friendly or popular. They were trying to keep these men alive by teaching them the skills they'd need in combat. And the men respected that. Link trainer instructors performed equally important work. The link trainer was a flight simulation device that allowed pilots to practice instrument flying without actually being in the air. It was a mechanical simulator with a cockpit that could pitch, roll, and yaw to simulate real flight conditions. Inside, the trainee pilot had to navigate using only his instruments. He was learning how to fly through clouds, storms, or darkness when he couldn't see the ground. Waves operated the link trainers from a booth near the simulator. They controlled the celestial dome and terrain plate to create realistic flying conditions. The operator could introduce simulated problems like wind drift, equipment malfunctions, or poor visibility. She controlled the radio communications, provided bearings, and monitored the pilot's performance. Training sessions often lasted 8 hours straight, running close to real time, and Waves worked right alongside the pilots they were training. Edna Jean Clark, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, became a link trainer instructor. Dorothy Forbes NS trained pilots in Lake City, Florida. These women enabled higher quality training for naval aviators and reduced the resource requirements needed to produce qualified air crews. By taking over the training, they freed male instructors to serve in other capacities. There was also a similar celestial navigation simulator that Waves operated. It trained pilots in the complex mathematics and techniques required for navigation over long distances. This was advanced technical work that required understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and navigation principles. Weather forecasters, called aerographers' mates, represented another highly specialized role. The Navy used approximately 100 Waves as weather forecasters at naval air stations. These women analyzed meteorological data, created weather maps, made forecasts for flight operations, and briefed pilots on the conditions they would face during their missions. Bad weather was one of the biggest hazards facing naval aviators. Accurate forecasting could mean the difference between a successful mission and a disaster. Marguerite Frances Hunold became one of the pioneering waves aerologists. She served at Sandpoint Naval Air Station, forecasting weather from the Aleutian Islands down to San Diego for naval aviators and surface ships. She personally briefed pilots on expected conditions. Her expertise earned her a promotion to lieutenant junior grade on January 1, 1944. By the end of the war, 23,000 waves had served in naval aviation roles. They had proven that women could perform the technical, demanding work required to keep a modern Air Force operational. They had trained pilots, maintained aircraft, managed flight operations, and saved countless lives through their professionalism and dedication. The Bureau of Aeronautics, which had been the most receptive to waves from the beginning, had also benefited the most from their service. The air navigation officers, but even with all those accomplishments, there was still one restriction that remained firmly in place through most of the war. Waves were prohibited from serving outside the continental United States. That meant they couldn't go to combat zones. They couldn't serve on ships at sea, and they couldn't deploy to critical overseas locations where the Navy desperately needed skilled personnel. That restriction was written directly into Public Law 689, the legislation that established the waves. It was a compromise designed to reassure conservatives that women wouldn't be placed in danger and that their service would remain clearly separate from combat operations. But as the war dragged on and the Navy's needs grew more urgent, that restriction became increasingly problematic. Hawaii, for example, was a major naval hub in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had been rebuilt after the Japanese attack. It was now the center of American naval operations against Japan. The base had enormous administrative, medical, and logistical operations that needed personnel. Alaska was another critical location, serving as a staging area for operations in the Aleutian Islands. It provided a defensive position against potential Japanese threats from the north. The Navy needed waves in those locations, but the law said no. So the Navy began lobbying Congress to change the law. Mildred McAfee and other waves leadership argued that the restriction was arbitrary and counterproductive. They pointed out that waves were serving with distinction in every shore-based role in the continental United States. There was no reason to believe they couldn't perform equally well in Hawaii or Alaska. These weren't combat zones in the traditional sense. They were administrative and support bases where women would be performing the same roles they already performed stateside. Finally, on September 27, 1944, Congress passed an amendment allowing waves to volunteer for service in Alaska, Hawaii, and the Caribbean. The key word was volunteer. The Navy couldn't order waves to serve overseas. Women had to choose to go, but plenty did. Hawaii became the only overseas location staffed with waves on a permanent basis during the war. Within months, waves were working at Pearl Harbor and other Hawaiian naval installations. They performed the same administrative, medical, and technical work they'd been doing in the continental United States. Captain Mildred McAfee visited Pearl Harbor in July 1945 on an inspection tour. She observed waves working in roles ranging from storekeepers managing salvage materials to clerks processing paperwork to medical personnel caring for wounded sailors. Alaska presented unique challenges. The weather was harsh. The facilities were more primitive, and the isolation was extreme. But waves volunteered to serve there too. Marguerite Hunold became the first female aerologist to serve in Alaska when she volunteered for temporary duty in the Alaska Territory in October 1944 to study Aleutian weather conditions. This type of weather familiarization assignment was common for servicemen, but Hunold was the first woman given the opportunity. When she flew north from Washington to begin her 11-day tour of the Aleutians, she landed at Elmendorf Field in Anchorage to a crowd of officers and pressmen waiting to document the first member of the waves in Alaska. The Navy also tasked her with identifying billeting arrangement options for future female aerographers assigned to Aleutian duty stations. They recognized that permanent postings of waves to the area were coming. But the most remarkable development came in the final months of the war. The Navy decided to train waves as air navigation officers. These weren't instructors or support personnel. These were fully qualified navigation officers who would fly on Naval Air Transport Service flights, navigating aircraft across thousands of miles of ocean. 80 waves were selected for this program. They received advanced training in celestial navigation, dead reckoning, radio navigation, and all the technical skills required to guide an aircraft from one point to another across vast distances where landmarks didn't exist. The mathematics were complex. The responsibility was enormous, and the Navy trusted these women to do it. Here's what made this so revolutionary. For the first time, waves weren't just supporting aviation operations from the ground. They were actually flying, serving as essential crew members on military aircraft. They were navigating planes across the Pacific, from the United States to Hawaii and beyond. They were proving that women could perform operational roles, not just administrative ones. The program came late in the war, so the 80 Waves air navigation officers didn't have the opportunity to serve for long. But they pioneered a path that would eventually lead to women serving as pilots, navigators, and aircrew members in future conflicts. They proved that the restrictions placed on women's service were arbitrary and unnecessary. And they demonstrated, once again, that when given the opportunity and proper training, women could perform any role in naval aviation as effectively as men. By the time the war ended in August 1945, waves in aviation had fundamentally transformed the Navy's air arm. They had taken over operations that were considered impossible for women just 3 years earlier. They had trained pilots, maintained aircraft, operated control towers, rigged parachutes, forecast weather, taught gunnery, and even navigated aircraft across the Pacific Ocean. They had saved lives. They had freed thousands of men for combat duty. And they had proven that the sky was no longer the exclusive domain of men. The question facing the Navy in 1945 wasn't whether women could serve in aviation. The question was whether the Navy could continue to operate its aviation establishment without them. Breaking the final barriers Navy's first female attorneys throughout the war, the Waves had been breaking barriers in field after field: administration, medicine, cryptanalysis, computing, aviation. But there was one profession that remained almost completely closed to women, even within the Waves: the legal profession. And specifically, the Navy's Judge Advocate General's Corps, known as the JAG Corps. The JAG Corps had been established by George Washington on July 29, 1775. That made it one of the oldest legal institutions in American history. Judge advocates served as legal advisors to commanders. They prosecuted and defended military law cases under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They provided counsel on administrative law, government contracting, personnel law, the law of war, and international relations. These were positions of significant authority and responsibility. Judge advocates had to be trained lawyers, and they needed to understand both civilian law and military regulations. In the civilian world, women were just beginning to break into the legal profession in significant numbers during the 1940s. Law schools were still predominantly male. Many law firms refused to hire female attorneys. The cultural assumption was that women didn't have the temperament for legal work, particularly litigation. The courtroom was seen as an adversarial, masculine space where aggressive advocacy was required. Women, the thinking went, were too emotional or too passive to be effective lawyers. The military legal establishment was even more conservative than civilian law firms. Consider how radical this seemed at the time. The idea of women serving as judge advocates was almost unthinkable to most Navy officers. How could a woman prosecute a court-martial? How could she advise a commanding officer on matters of military law? How could she have authority over male defendants or witnesses? The cultural barriers were enormous. But as with so many other fields, the manpower shortage forced the Navy to reconsider. There were women who had been practicing attorneys in civilian life before the war. Many had excellent legal credentials, including degrees from top law schools. They had experience in litigation, contract law, and administrative proceedings. And they wanted to serve their country. The Navy needed legal personnel, particularly for administrative law work at shore establishments. So barriers began to fall. WWIIs who had been attorneys in civilian life were allowed to join the JAG Corps and serve as judge advocates. They worked on legal matters at naval installations across the United States. They reviewed contracts. They provided legal opinions on personnel matters. They handled administrative proceedings. And they proved, as WWIIs had proven in every other field, that gender had nothing to do with legal competence. The number of female judge advocates was small during the war. Their work remained largely confined to administrative and civil matters rather than criminal prosecution or defense. But the precedent was established. Women could serve in the Navy's legal branch. They could analyze complex legal issues. They could provide competent counsel. And they could hold their own in a profession that had been exclusively male for nearly 2 centuries. This development had implications far beyond the Navy. After the war, many of these women returned to civilian legal practice. They brought with them the experience and confidence gained from serving as military attorneys. They became role models for younger women considering legal careers. They demonstrated that women could succeed in litigation and legal advisory roles. And they helped chip away at the barriers that kept women out of the legal profession more broadly. The Navy's acceptance of female judge advocates during World War II represented another brick removed from the wall of gender discrimination. It wasn't a complete breakthrough. Women still faced enormous obstacles in the legal profession, both military and civilian, for decades after the war ended. But it was progress. And like so many other achievements by WWIIs during the war, it established a foundation that future generations of women would build upon. Integration. October 19th, 1944, but even as WWIIs were breaking barriers in field after field, there was one barrier that remained firmly in place through most of the war. The color line. African American women were completely excluded from the WWIIs from the program's establishment in July 1942 until October 1944. This exclusion wasn't explicitly written into Public Law 689, the legislation that created the WWIIs. The law was silent on the question of race. But silence didn't mean equality. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox made his position crystal clear. He stated that black WWIIs would be enlisted over his dead body. That wasn't rhetoric. It was policy. African American women who tried to volunteer for the WWIIs were turned away. Their applications were rejected. They were told in various ways that they weren't wanted. This discrimination was particularly painful because African American women were eager to serve. When the WWIIs program was announced in 1942, numerous African American women attempted to enlist. They met all the qualifications. Many were college educated, which was the requirement for WWIIs officers. Others had the high school education and skills needed for enlisted positions. But none of that mattered. The Navy didn't want them. During the congressional hearings on the legislation creating the WWII, Thomasina Walker of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority's nonpartisan political council testified. She argued that the law should include a non-discrimination clause so that all eligible women could volunteer to serve. Her argument fell on deaf ears. The final legislation included no such protection, and the Navy exploited that silence to maintain racial segregation. The exclusion was part of a broader pattern of discrimination in the Navy. Secretary Knox preferred to keep African American sailors confined to the steward's branch, where they were relegated to servant roles. Many, like Mess Attendant Second Class Harold Ward, found these assignments demeaning and disappointing. The Navy's racial policies were among the most restrictive in the entire military. While the Army had begun accepting African American women into the Women's Army Corps, the Navy remained completely closed. But there were people fighting for change. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, kept pressure on the Navy and the Roosevelt administration. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who had been instrumental in getting the WWII established in the first place, supported opening the program to African American women. And critically, Lieutenant Commander Mildred McAfee, the director of the WWII, was a steadfast supporter of integration. Then something changed. Secretary Knox died suddenly from a heart attack in April 1944. His death removed the single biggest obstacle to integration. His successor, James Forrestal, was more progressive on racial issues. On July 28, 1944, Forrestal submitted to President Roosevelt a proposal to accept African American women into the WWII on an integrated basis. But there was a problem. 1944 was an election year. Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term against Republican candidate Thomas Dewey. The president didn't want to make a controversial decision that might cost him votes, particularly among conservative Southern Democrats who supported segregation. So he held up Forrestal's proposal, waiting until after the November 7th election. The delay created a political problem. Dewey criticized the Roosevelt administration for discriminating against African American women during a campaign speech in Chicago. The issue was becoming a liability. Civil rights organizations intensified their pressure. African American newspapers covered the story extensively. The exclusion of black women from the WWII while white women served was becoming an embarrassment for an administration that claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy abroad. Finally, on October 19, 1944, President Roosevelt instructed the Navy to accept African American women into the WWII. The announcement made headlines across the country: Navy to admit Negroes into the WWII. For the first time in the Navy's history, black women would be commissioned as naval officers. But the question remained, would they be accepted on an integrated basis, or would the Navy establish segregated training and housing? Forrestal initially tried to compromise by proposing segregated living quarters and mess facilities. But there was a practical problem. Each recruit company at USS Hunter contained 250 women. There weren't enough African American recruits to form an entire segregated company. McAfee appealed to Forrestal, arguing that segregation was impractical and unnecessary. He agreed and dropped the segregation requirement. This was extraordinary. The Navy was going to integrate its women's reserve program even though most of the rest of the military, including the regular Navy, remained segregated. African American WWII would train alongside white WWII. They would live in the same barracks. They would eat in the same mess halls. They would serve in the same units. It was a remarkable step forward, even if limitations and discrimination would persist in some areas. Now the Navy needed to find the first African American women to commission as WWII officers. The choice was critical. These women would be under intense scrutiny. They would face skepticism and prejudice. They needed to be exceptionally qualified, resilient, and prepared for the challenges ahead. The Navy selected two women, Harriet Ida Pickens and Frances Elizabeth Wills. Harriet Pickens was born in Talladega, Alabama. Her father was William Pickens, an educator, writer, and early member of the NAACP. She had graduated from Smith College with a degree in public health. She later took courses in political science at Columbia University. She had also studied at Bennett College for Women. At the time of her enlistment, she was working as the executive secretary at the Harlem Tuberculosis and Health Committee in New York City. She enlisted on November 13, 1944. Frances Wills was born in Philadelphia. She had earned degrees from Hunter College and the University of Pittsburgh. She was working as a social worker in New York City when she enlisted alongside Pickens. Both women had impressive credentials. Both were highly educated, professionally accomplished, and deeply committed to serving their country. On November 13, 1944, Pickens and Wills enlisted in the Waves. They were sent to the Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. This was the same institution where McAfee had established the Waves officer training program 2 years earlier. But there was a problem. By the time Pickens and Wills arrived at Smith, the other prospective officers in their class had already been studying for 3 weeks. The two women were behind before they even started. They were given a room together. This wasn't because of segregation, as some might have assumed. It was simply because that was the only space still open. But the symbolism was powerful. These two pioneering women, facing an enormous challenge, had each other for support. Wills later recalled that each morning Pickens would say, "Here we go again," rousing her to battle one more time. And it was a battle. Pickens and Wills had only 5 weeks to make up for the 3 weeks they'd missed. The curriculum was intensive: naval organization, personnel procedures, ships and aircraft, communications, law, history, and tradition. They studied constantly. They spent all their free time making up the lost ground. Imagine the pressure they faced. Every exam, every drill, every inspection was a test not just of their individual abilities, but of whether African American women belonged in the Navy at all. They knew that their performance would be used to judge all Black women who might follow them. The pressure was immense, but they succeeded. On December 21, 1944, Harriet Ida Pickens was commissioned as a lieutenant junior grade. Frances Elizabeth Wills was commissioned as an ensign. They became the first African American women ever commissioned as officers in the United States Navy. It was a historic moment. Pickens later received a promotion to full lieutenant, making her the highest-ranking African American woman in the Navy during the war. After commissioning, both women were assigned to work at the Waves training facility at Hunter College in New York City. Pickens supervised the physical training of Waves recruits, ensuring that women met the Navy's fitness standards. Wills worked in other administrative capacities. They served alongside white officers. They ate in the same mess. They lived in the same quarters. For the Waves at Hunter College, integration was simply the way things were done. But the experience of African American Waves varied depending on where they served. While training at Hunter College was integrated, some naval bases maintained segregated living accommodations and specialty assignments for Black Waves. The Navy's commitment to integration was real but incomplete. African American Waves faced restrictions and discrimination that their white counterparts didn't experience. Still, compared to the complete exclusion that had existed just months earlier, it was progress. By July 1945, 72 African American women had undergone Waves recruit training. That was a tiny fraction of the more than 80,000 total Waves who served during the war. But it was a beginning. 5 more African American women joined the Navy Nurse Corps on an integrated basis. Those who stayed in the waves after the war were employed without discrimination, although only 5 African American waves remained in service by August 1946. What did this mean for the future? The integration of the waves in 1944 was a significant moment in American military history. It came years before President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which ordered the integration of the entire military. The waves demonstrated that integration could work. Black and white women could train together, serve together, and live together without the chaos and disruption that segregationists had predicted. The success of waves integration provided a model and an argument for broader integration efforts. Harriet Pickens and Frances Wills had opened a door. It was a door that should never have been closed in the first place. But they opened it anyway, through determination, excellence, and courage. After the war, Pickens returned to her work at the Harlem Tuberculosis and Health Committee, where she continued serving her community for decades. Both women lived long lives, witnessing the continued progress toward equality in the military and in American society more broadly. Their legacy extends beyond their individual service. They proved that African American women could serve with distinction in the United States Navy. They demonstrated that integration was not only possible but beneficial. And they paved the way for the thousands of Black women who would serve in the Navy in the decades to come, including admirals, aviators, and leaders across every field of naval operations. The final barrier hadn't been completely destroyed, but Pickens and Wills had cracked it, and that was enough to ensure it would eventually fall. Victory and the question of what's next. August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. VJ Day. The war was over. After 4 years of fighting, the Japanese had surrendered. Millions of lives had been lost. American industry and manpower had been mobilized at an unprecedented scale. And now, finally, it was ending. Throughout the United States, celebrations erupted in the streets. Sailors kissed nurses in Times Square. Church bells rang. Sirens wailed. People danced, cried, hugged strangers, and thanked God that the nightmare was finally ending. For the American military, it was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Men could come home. Families could be reunited. Life could return to normal. But for the women of the waves, VJ Day brought a complicated mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly. Pride in what they had accomplished, absolutely. But also uncertainty. And for many, apprehension about what came next. By the summer of 1945, the waves had reached their peak strength, over 86,000 women serving in nearly every conceivable shore-based role in the Navy. They had become indispensable. The Navy's shore establishment couldn't function without them. Commanding officers who had initially resisted having women in the service were now writing letters praising their waves personnel and requesting more. The program that started with skepticism and discrimination had become one of the Navy's greatest success stories. But Public Law 689, the legislation that created the waves, specified that the program would last only for the duration of the war plus 6 months. That meant the waves would be disbanded. All those women who had proven themselves in technical roles, in administration, in medicine, in aviation, in cryptanalysis would be sent home. The Navy would lose tens of thousands of trained, experienced personnel at exactly the moment when it needed to manage the massive task of demobilization. Here's the dilemma the Navy faced. The question in August 1945 was stark. Could it afford to let the waves go? Many waves wanted to go home. They had joined to serve during an emergency, not as a permanent career. They had put their civilian lives on hold, college educations, careers, marriages, families. Now that the war was over, they wanted to resume those lives. They had done their duty and they were ready to move on. The Navy understood that and respected it. These women had volunteered during their country's darkest hour and had served with distinction. If they wanted to return to civilian life, they had earned that right. But not all waves wanted to leave. Some had discovered that they loved naval service. They had found meaningful work, camaraderie, and a sense of purpose that they hadn't experienced in civilian life. They had proven that they could perform at the highest levels in technical and professional fields. Many had achieved positions of responsibility and authority that would be difficult or impossible to attain as women in the civilian world of the 1940s. Grace Hopper, for example, wanted to continue her work with computers. Hospital corpsmen wanted to continue serving in Navy medicine. Aviation specialists wanted to keep working in the field they'd grown to love. And critically, the Navy wanted them to stay. Not out of sentimentality or political correctness, but out of practical necessity. The Navy was going to remain enormous even after demobilization. The United States had emerged from World War II as a global superpower with responsibilities around the world. The Navy needed to maintain a large shore establishment to support its operations. And having experienced firsthand how effectively women could perform in those roles, Navy leadership realized that excluding women permanently would be a strategic mistake. But there was a problem. The law said the WWII had to be disbanded. If the Navy wanted to keep women in the service permanently, it would need Congress to pass new legislation. And that would be controversial. World War II had required extraordinary measures, including allowing women into the military. But now that the emergency was over, many Americans wanted things to return to normal. And normal, for most people, meant men in the military and women at home. The fight for permanent status was about to begin, and it would take years to win. Lieutenant Commander Mildred McAfee, who had led the WWII since their creation, was exhausted. She had overseen the establishment and growth of an organization that went from 0 to over 86,000 members in just 3 years. She had navigated military bureaucracy, congressional politics, and cultural resistance. She had proven that women could serve with distinction. But she was ready to return to her life as an educator. In February 1946, she was released from active duty and returned to Wellesley College. Her service had earned her the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest non-combat awards the Navy could bestow. Captain Joy Bright Hancock, who had championed WWII in naval aviation, took on the fight for permanent status. She understood that the Navy needed women permanently, not just during emergencies. She also understood that the political battle would be difficult, but she was determined to see it through. The Navy began its demobilization process. By August 1946, the number of WWII had dropped to about 12,000. Most had returned to civilian life, but thousands remained, either because they wanted to stay or because the Navy still desperately needed them. These women were in limbo. The law said the WWII's program was temporary, but they were still serving because the Navy couldn't function without them. Something had to change. Either the Navy had to discharge the remaining WWIIs and figure out how to replace them with men, which would be expensive and inefficient, or Congress had to pass legislation allowing women to serve permanently. The Navy chose to fight for the second option. Now here's what made this complicated. The question wasn't just about the WWIIs. All the women's service branches faced the same issue: the Women's Army Corps, the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, the Coast Guard SPARS, and the women in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps. If women were going to serve permanently in any branch, it made sense to address all of them in a single piece of legislation. The military services coordinated their efforts and approached Congress with a unified proposal. They called it the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, and it would take 2 years of political fighting to get it passed. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948 and beyond June 12, 1948. President Harry S. Truman signed Public Law 516, officially known as the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, into law. With that signature, women became a permanent part of the United States military for the first time in American history. The legislation authorized the establishment of permanent women's components in the regular Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force, as well as in their respective reserve components. Women could now serve in the military as a career, not just during wartime emergencies. They would receive the same pay as men of equivalent rank. They would have access to many of the same benefits, including retirement and veterans' preference in federal employment. But the legislation also included significant restrictions. Women were limited to just 2% of the total force in each service. They couldn't command men. They couldn't serve on combat aircraft or combat vessels. There were restrictions on how high they could be promoted. And there were provisions that made it easier to discharge women than men for various reasons, including pregnancy or having dependent children. Still, despite those limitations, it was a revolutionary moment. For the first time, the United States military officially recognized that women had a permanent place in national defense. The WWIIs, which had been created as a temporary wartime measure, were now a permanent part of the United States Navy. Joy Bright Hancock, who had fought so hard for this outcome, was appointed as the Assistant Chief of Naval Personnel for Women in October 1946, even before the legislation passed. She had the difficult task of managing the transition from the temporary WWIIs program to the permanent Women's Reserve. She oversaw recruiting, training, assignments, and career development for women in the Navy. And she continued to fight for expanding opportunities for women in naval service. The term WWIIs officially referred to the Women's Reserve. It continued to be used informally for another 25 years. But after 1948, women in the Navy weren't really in a separate women's reserve anymore. They were simply part of the Navy. The distinction would gradually blur over the decades as women became increasingly integrated into naval operations. Think about what this legacy means today. The legacy of the World War II WWIIs extended far beyond just establishing permanent military service for women. These women had fundamentally changed American society's understanding of what women could do. Before the war, most people believed that women were unsuited for technical, professional, or leadership roles in military or industrial settings. The WWIIs proved that belief was completely wrong. Grace Hopper continued her work with computers and eventually retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral in 1986. Her contributions to computer science, including the development of COBOL and the concept of machine-independent programming languages, helped create the digital age we live in today. She showed that women could be pioneers in the most cutting-edge technical fields. The medical professionals who served as hospital corpsmen and physicians paved the way for women in military medicine. Today, women serve at every level of Navy medicine, including as commanding officers of naval hospitals and as the Surgeon General of the Navy. The barriers that seemed insurmountable in 1942 are barely remembered today. The aviation specialists who maintained aircraft, rigged parachutes, operated control towers, and even navigated aircraft opened the door for women pilots, astronauts, and aerospace engineers. In 1973, the Navy began training women as pilots. Today, women fly combat aircraft, command aviation squadrons, and have reached the rank of admiral in the naval aviation community. The 80 WWIIs air navigation officers who flew in the final months of World War II were the first generation of a revolution that continues today. The codebreakers who worked in complete secrecy helped establish that women could handle the most sensitive classified work. Today, Women serve throughout the intelligence community at the highest levels, including as directors of major intelligence agencies. The trust placed in those World War II waves was fully justified, and it opened doors that have never closed. Perhaps most importantly, Harriet Ida Pickens and Frances Elizabeth Wills, who broke the color barrier in 1944, started a process that would eventually lead to full integration of the military. Their courage in the face of discrimination and their excellence in service proved that race had no bearing on military confidence. Today, women of all races serve in every branch of the military at every rank, including as four-star generals and admirals. The door they opened led to opportunities that have transformed millions of lives. The numbers tell part of the story. During World War II, approximately 100,000 women served in the waves. 8,475 were commissioned as officers. The rest served as enlisted personnel in ratings that had previously been exclusively male. They served at 900 shore stations across the United States and eventually in Hawaii and Alaska. They filled critical roles that freed tens of thousands of men for sea duty and combat operations. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. What matters more is what these women proved. They proved that women could perform technical work as effectively as men. They proved that women could handle classified information and be trusted with the nation's most important secrets. They proved that women could serve in professional roles and exercise leadership. They proved that women could adapt to military discipline and culture. And most importantly, they proved that arbitrary restrictions based on gender were counterproductive and unjust. The skeptics who had opposed the waves in 1942 had been proven wrong on every count. The Navy hadn't been weakened by allowing women to serve. It had been strengthened. Morale hadn't been destroyed. It had been enhanced. The masculine warrior culture hadn't been undermined. It had been expanded to recognize that service and sacrifice aren't gendered concepts. Every argument that had been used to exclude women from the Navy had been demolished by the performance of the waves themselves. The question that had been asked at the beginning of the war, can women run America's Navy operations, had been answered definitively. Not only could they run those operations, they had run them better than many people thought possible. They had transformed the Navy. They had changed American society. And they had opened doors that would never be fully closed again. Look at where we are today. Women serve in every branch of the United States military in virtually every role. They command ships at sea, fly combat aircraft, lead Marines in battle, and hold positions of the highest responsibility throughout the defense establishment. They are generals and admirals. They are pilots and submariners. They are special operations soldiers and combat engineers. The barriers that the waves began breaking in 1942 have continued to fall, one after another, decade after decade. And it all started with a crisis in 1942, when the Navy didn't have enough men to staff its shore operations. It started with a controversial decision to allow women to serve temporarily for the duration of the war. It started with Mildred McAfee, who took on the enormous challenge of building an organization from scratch. It started with the thousands of women who volunteered to serve their country when it needed them most. They were told they were just filling in temporarily while the men were away. They were told not to get too comfortable because they'd be going home soon. They were told that certain things were impossible for women to do. And then they went out and did those impossible things anyway. They ran communication centers, operated computers, broke enemy codes, maintained aircraft, trained pilots, treated wounded sailors, provided legal counsel, and managed the entire shore establishment of the United States Navy. They did it professionally, efficiently, and with a level of excellence that earned the respect of even their harshest critics. The incredible women who ran America's Navy operations in World War II didn't just win a war. They won a revolution. And their legacy continues every single day in the service of the men and women who followed the path they pioneered.